Chapter 3: The Patriarchal Figures. Abraham and the Promise. In human history, Abraham is a central and pivotal figure. Born in the city of Ur in present-day Iraq, Abraham is known as the father of the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His life and faith represent God's promise to humanity. According to the Bible, God asked Abraham to leave his land and people to go to an unknown place. God promised Abraham great descendants, land and blessing for all the nations of the earth. Although Abraham did not know the destination, he obeyed God and embarked on a journey of faith. This act of obedience and trust in God is the key to understanding the figure of Abraham. The promise made to Abraham was not immediately fulfilled. There were trials and difficulties along the way. Abraham and his wife Sarah were forced to face infertility, a condition that seemed to make God's promise impossible. However, despite the apparent impossibilities, Abraham never stopped believing in God's promise. His faith was rewarded when, at the ripe old age of 100, Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac. This miraculous event confirmed God's faithfulness to his promise. Abraham's experience teaches us that God's promise is not always easy to understand or accept. It may require sacrifice, patience, and trust. However, Abraham's story also shows us that God is faithful to his promises. No matter how difficult or impossible it may seem, God always keeps his word. The figure of Abraham offers us an important lesson about faith. It is not only about believing in God, but also about trusting him, even when circumstances seem to contradict his promises. Abraham did not just believe in God. He trusted him, obeyed his commands, and waited patiently for the fulfillment of his promises. Moreover, the story of Abraham shows us that God's promise is not just for an individual or a people, but for all mankind. God has promised to bless all the nations of the earth through Abraham. This is the universal vision of God's plan, which transcends any barrier of race, culture, or religion. God's promise to Abraham is thus a message of hope for all of us. No matter who we are, where we come from, or what our circumstances are, we can trust in God's faithfulness. Like Abraham, we can have confidence that God will keep his promises. The figure of Abraham and the promise of God thus represent a fundamental reference point for understanding the face of God. Through the story of Abraham, God reveals himself as a faithful God who keeps his promises and desires to bless all humankind. Isaac and the Test of Faith. The biblical account of Isaac and the test of faith is one of the most powerful and controversial in the book of Genesis. This story, which recounts Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son Isaac to obey a command from God, has been interpreted in many different ways over the centuries, but it remains a powerful example of faith and obedience. The story begins with God testing Abraham's faith by ordering him to sacrifice his only begotten son, Isaac. Abraham, though distressed, agrees to carry out God's order. He prepares wood for the fire, binds Isaac, and places him on the altar. But just as he is about to strike with a knife, an angel of the Lord intervenes, stopping Abraham and replacing Isaac with a ram for the sacrifice. This narrative has profound theological implications. First, it highlights Abraham's total obedience to God, despite the fact that the divine order goes against his every natural inclination as a father. Moreover, it emphasizes the mercy of God, who intervenes at the last moment to save Isaac. But there is another aspect of this story that deserves attention: the role of Isaac. Although he is often seen as a passive character, his willingness to submit to the will of his father and God is equally significant. At the decisive moment, Isaac does not run away or resist, but accepts his fate. This makes him as much an example of faith and obedience as Abraham. It is interesting to note how the figure of Isaac has been interpreted over the centuries. In Jewish tradition, Isaac is seen as a hero who willingly offers himself for sacrifice, while in Christianity, he is often seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus, the Son of God, sacrificed for the salvation of humanity. But this story has also attracted much criticism. Some see it as an example of divine cruelty, while others see it as an incitement to infanticide. These interpretations, however, tend to ignore the historical and cultural context in which the story was written. Indeed, the story of Isaac and the test of faith is a powerful example of how the Bible can be interpreted in different ways, depending on one's beliefs and cultural context. But beyond the different interpretations, this story remains a powerful example of faith and obedience that continues to challenge and inspire believers of all religious traditions. Finally, the story of Isaac and the test of faith reminds us that faith is never easy or without challenge. It requires sacrifice, obedience, and unconditional trust in God. But even in the midst of the most difficult trials, God never abandons His faithful, but intervenes in surprising and merciful ways. Jacob and spiritual combat. In the biblical narrative, Jacob emerges as a major character because of his spiritual struggle. His story is a powerful symbol of how man can confront God, struggle with Him, and ultimately be transformed. The biblical account of Jacob wrestling with an angel during the night is an emblematic episode of this spiritual combat. Jacob, in the middle of the night, found himself wrestling with a mysterious being who, in the end, turned out to be an angel of God. This struggle lasted until dawn, and Jacob did not give up, even when the angel struck him in the thigh, leaving him lame. This episode is a profound and powerful picture of the spiritual combat that every believer faces. Jacob represents humanity in its search for God, in its struggle to understand and accept the divine will. In spite of difficulties, in spite of pain, Jacob does not give up, but continues to struggle, showing an endurance and determination that are exemplary. Jacob does not emerge from this spiritual combat as a victor in the earthly sense of the term. He is wounded, lame, but he is also changed. His fight with the angel has transformed him, strengthened his faith, deepened his understanding of God. This is the true meaning of spiritual combat. It is not about winning or losing, but about being transformed, growing in faith and knowledge of God. Jacob's struggle teaches us that spiritual combat is not a negative or destructive experience, but an opportunity for growth and transformation. Through struggle, through challenge, we are called to confront God, to try to understand Him, to try to accept His will, even when we do not understand it or when it seems difficult or painful. Jacob's story also teaches us that God is not an adversary to fear, but an ally to seek. Despite the struggle, despite the pain, Jacob does not turn away from God, but draws near to Him, clings to Him. And in the end, he is blessed by God, who changes his name from Jacob to Israel, which means the one who struggles with God. Spiritual combat, then, is not only a struggle, but also an embrace, an encounter with God. It is a process of growth and transformation, leading us to a deeper understanding and a more intimate relationship with God. Like Jacob, we are called to struggle, to seek, to never give up, even in the face of difficulties and doubts. And like Jacob, we can be sure that at the end of our struggle, we will find God waiting for us, ready to bless and transform us. Joseph and divine providence. In salvation history, the figure of Joseph reveals with great clarity the mystery of divine providence. Joseph, Jacob's beloved son, is sold as a slave by his envious brothers. However, despite adversity and disappointment, Joseph never loses faith in God. On the contrary, he remains faithful to his calling and mission, recognizing in every circumstance the hand of God guiding his life. Joseph is a character who embodies faith in God's action, even when everything seems to go wrong. He is a model of trusting abandonment into God's hands, an example of how God can turn evil into good. His life is a powerful witness to the love of God, who never abandons His children but guides them with love toward their destiny. Joseph's story begins with a dream of future greatness, which triggers the envy of his brothers. Sold as a slave, Joseph finds himself in Egypt, where, through his wisdom and integrity, he becomes a man of great importance. But even in this position, Joseph does not forget God. On the contrary, he acknowledges His presence in every event of his life. In his time of need, when famine strikes the land, Joseph responds with generosity, providing food for his brothers who do not recognize him. Despite the betrayal he suffered, Joseph forgives and welcomes his brothers, recognizing God's plan in all of this. Joseph's life is a clear example of how divine providence is not an abstract concept, but a living, working reality in everyday life. God is not a distant observer, but a loving Father who intervenes in human history, lovingly guiding their steps. Joseph's story teaches us that we must never lose hope, even in the most difficult situations. God is always by our side, ready to turn evil into good, to bring light into darkness. Faith in God does not exempt us from the trials of life, but gives us the strength to face them with courage and hope. Divine providence is not a ploy to avoid difficulties, but a certainty that illuminates the path of life. Faith in God is not a refuge for the weak, but a strength for the strong, a light that illuminates the path of life. Joseph shows us that faith in God is not an illusion, but a concrete reality that gives meaning to life. Divine providence is not an abstract concept, but a living reality at work in everyday life. God is always present, even when he seems absent. Joseph's story is an invitation to look beyond appearances, to recognize God's hand even in the most adverse circumstances. Faith in God is not an illusion, but a concrete reality that gives meaning to life. Divine providence is not an abstract concept, but a living reality at work in everyday life. God is always present, even when he seems absent.